These are 6 innocent people who ended up in prison. The dilemma of the innocent prisoner. One of the greatest fears you can have in court is receiving a sentence based on a false accusation and watching the evidence and witness statements point straight at you. There's no worse feeling than knowing you didn't do anything, and that there's nothing you can do to avoid going to prison. You feel like the whole world is against you, like everyone accusing you is wrong, and the justice system is failing you. That's why people often quote that famous phrase by William Blackstone. It is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. Statistically, it sounds odd, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. It only applies to cases where there's reasonable doubt, and thankfully, those aren't as common as they seem. Put simply, when in doubt, let them go. With such a sensitive subject, we expect maximum accuracy. We expect no innocent person to end up behind bars. But we're not machines. And sadly, even with the best intentions, serious mistakes have been made. Mistakes that ruined lives. Mistakes that still happen today. Not just in the past. Lies, errors, hidden evidence. A web of failure that continues to trap the innocent. Case number 6. Ricky Jackson. He spent 39 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. The injustice was so blatant that the state of Ohio awarded him $1 million in compensation. But let's be real. How could that possibly make up for it? Almost an entire lifetime locked away for a sum that doesn't come close to restoring what was lost. There's no way to compensate for time, because time doesn't come back. And yet, Ricky was grateful. Over the years, he came to accept what happened. During the first 5 or 6 years, all he could feel was rage, fear, and helplessness. But eventually, he accepted it as something beyond his control. He was released in 2015 at the age of 58. He had been just 19 when they locked him up. And all it took to convict him, all it took to sentence him to death, was the statement of a 13-year-old boy. That's it. No other witnesses, no physical evidence, just the word of a kid. That boy, Eddie Vernon, claimed he saw Jackson and 2 other boys at the store where a clerk had been murdered. Authorities said it was a robbery. The 3 young men were sentenced to death. Luckily, due to procedural delays, the executions were postponed long enough for the truth to surface. A group called the Innocence Project got involved, and in a twist of fate, it was that same boy, Eddie Vernon, who helped set Ricky free. He finally admitted he had lied. The police had pressured him. They forced him to say what they wanted. Surprised, a black man sent to prison because the police wanted it that way? Years later, Eddie retracted his statement. But that alone wasn't enough. He had to make it official, with a sworn declaration before a judge. That's the danger of coerced testimony. The pressure from the police can be so overwhelming that it doesn't just break witnesses. It can even make the accused believe they're guilty. People crumble under that kind of force. Some confess to crimes they never committed, just to make it stop. And that's where the real dilemma begins. Once the system labels someone as guilty, the rules change. In some countries, inmates can have their sentences reduced if they admit guilt and express remorse. But if they insist they're innocent, the system treats them as unrepentant, as if they're in denial, and that denial is often enough to keep them behind bars. So what do you do if you're truly innocent? Admit to something you didn't do just to get out, or stand your ground and risk staying in prison forever? Many innocent people, faced with that impossible choice, have confessed just to be free. And once you say you're guilty, proving your innocence becomes even harder. Only a few chose their dignity over their freedom. They refused to lie. They kept their pride intact, and many of them died in prison. Michael Shirley. Michael Shirley was barely 18 years old when he was sentenced to life in prison. He spent 16 years locked up for a crime he didn't commit. The worst part? He had a solid alibi, but the police didn't believe him, and the system, once again, failed. The story begins in 1986. A woman named Linda Cook was brutally assaulted and murdered near her home in Portsmouth, England. It was a horrible crime. The press ran with it. People were desperate to find a suspect. The police were under pressure, and Michael Shirley became the perfect scapegoat. He was young, lived nearby, and had a bit of a rebellious streak, so they pinned it on him. The investigation was rushed. The evidence? Flimsy at best. Witnesses placed him at the scene, but they were mistaken. Michael insisted he had been out drinking that night with friends, and not just at any time, but during the exact window when the crime took place. He even had friends who backed up his story. But it didn't matter. The jury believed the prosecution, and Michael went to prison. For 16 years, he maintained his innocence. Over and over again. He refused to confess. He refused to show remorse for something he hadn't done, and because of that, he was denied parole. He'd spent nearly 2 decades behind bars because he told the truth. Then in 2002, a breakthrough. DNA evidence. A test that hadn't existed at the time of the trial now had the power to overturn everything. The new analysis proved conclusively that the DNA found on Linda Cook's body did not belong to Michael. It belonged to someone else. Someone they never identified. Michael was finally exonerated. He was freed. But by then, he had lost everything. His youth, his opportunities, his trust in the system. He was 34 years old, and the world had moved on without him. He later said that the most painful part wasn't prison itself. It was knowing that no matter how loudly he shouted the truth, no one listened. No one believed him. Until science did. Archie Williams. In 1983, a woman was assaulted and stabbed in her own home. She survived, but the trauma changed her forever. During the investigation, she was shown a group of photos, mugshots. One of them was of Archie Williams, a young black man who had already been arrested before, but for unrelated reasons. The victim hesitated, then pointed at him. That was all it took. Her statement was enough to send him to prison for 37 years. Archie insisted he was innocent, and he was. But at that time, no one listened. The prosecution was aggressive. They wanted someone to blame, and Archie, young, poor, and black, fit the profile. The fingerprint found at the scene? It wasn't his. In fact, it didn't match anyone in the police database at the time. But instead of interpreting that as a red flag, the court allowed it to be overlooked, and Archie went to prison. He was 22. He wouldn't see freedom again until he was 59. In all those years, he never stopped saying the same thing: I didn't do it. And then one day, someone listened. The Innocence Project took on his case. They demanded that the fingerprint be tested again, this time against an expanded national database. And guess what? They got a hit. The print belonged to Stephen Forbes, a serial offender who had committed other crimes in similar circumstances. That was the proof they needed. Archie was released in 2019, and when he stepped out of prison, the world welcomed him in a way he never expected. One of his greatest passions was music, and just months after his release, he was invited to perform on America's Got Talent. His voice, filled with pain, experience, and dignity, moved millions. For the first time in his life, he was seen not as a suspect, but as a man. The most powerful part of his story isn't the mistake, it's what he chose to do with it. Archie forgave, he rebuilt, and he became a symbol of resilience. Not everyone survives 37 years of injustice with their soul intact. Archie did, and he never let it take away his will to sing. Juan Rivera. This story happened in 1992. An 11-year-old girl named Holly Staker was found dead in her own home. She had been assaulted, beaten, and murdered. The case shocked the entire city of Waukegan, Illinois. The police launched a massive investigation. Public pressure was enormous, and soon they had a suspect, a teenager named Juan Rivera. He was just 19 years old. He had a minor criminal record, mostly for theft, but nothing violent. That didn't matter. The police brought him in, questioned him for hours, and claimed he confessed. But here's the thing. That confession didn't make sense. It was full of contradictions. He said he'd used a key to enter the apartment, but there was no sign of forced entry and no key was ever found. He said he'd been with the girl before the crime, but the timeline didn't match. His entire statement was a mess. but the police said it was good enough. And the jury agreed. Juan Rivera was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the truth is even more disturbing. He didn't just go to trial once. He was convicted 3 times in 3 separate trials for the same crime. In each one, the same faulty evidence was presented. The same manipulated confession was used, and in each one, he maintained his innocence. Years passed, technology improved, and in 2005, they finally tested the DNA found at the scene. It wasn't Juan's, not even close. Still, prosecutors insisted he was guilty. They argued that maybe she had been with someone else before the attack, that the DNA didn't prove anything. It was absurd. They refused to back down. It wasn't until 2012, 20 years after the crime, that Juan Rivera was finally exonerated. His lawyers proved that the confession had been coerced, that the timeline didn't fit, that the DNA excluded him completely, and that the real killer had never been found. Juan was released after 2 decades in prison. He later received $20 million in compensation, but the scars remain. He spoke openly about the trauma of being locked up for something he didn't do, about losing his youth, about watching the world move on without him, and about the mental collapse he suffered while behind bars. He wasn't the only victim of this case. Justice was denied for Holly Staker as well, because while Juan sat in prison, the real killer was free. Rafael Riccardi. Rafael Riccardi spent 13 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And unlike the others on this list, he wasn't in the United States. His case took place in Spain. It happened in 1995. Rafael was accused of raping a woman. The evidence? Her word alone. She had described her attacker with a few physical traits, and Rafael, unfortunately, matched them. That was enough. Even though he had an alibi, even though he insisted he had never seen that woman before in his life. The judge still believed her. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 13. And then one day, after over a decade behind bars, something happened. The court approved a request to reanalyze the evidence, this time using DNA testing, and that changed everything. The results proved that Rafael Riccardi was innocent. He hadn't touched that woman. He hadn't even been near her. The case fell apart, and he was finally released. Now let me ask you something. How much would you expect in compensation for spending 13 years of your life in prison for something you didn't do? €1 million? 2? Rafael received €120,000. That's less than $10,000 per year behind bars, less than minimum wage, for having his entire life taken from him. When asked how he felt, Rafael said he wasn't angry anymore. He said that, at first, all he wanted was revenge, that he dreamt of getting back at the people who put him there. But over time, he realized that holding on to hate would only destroy him. He chose peace. He chose to start over. But there's a detail that very few people know, something that makes this case even sadder. During his time in prison, Rafael suffered a traumatic brain injury after falling from the top bunk in his cell. He hit his head, lost consciousness, and woke up with permanent neurological damage. Today, he lives with a disability that affects his coordination and speech. He never fully recovered. So let's recap. Rafael lost 13 years of his freedom. He was labeled a rapist. He suffered brain damage, and the people who convicted him never faced consequences. Not one. Richard Phillips. Richard Phillips holds a tragic record. He is the person who spent the most years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 46 years. Almost half a century behind bars, being innocent. It all started in 1971. A man named Gregory Harris was found murdered near Detroit. The police quickly identified 2 suspects, Richard Phillips and a man named Richard Palumbo. The evidence? Circumstantial at best. The real key to the conviction was Palumbo's testimony. He blamed Phillips. That's all it took. Richard was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He was 27 years old. He wouldn't be free again until he was 73. For decades, he insisted on his innocence. He never changed his story. He didn't ask for reduced time. He didn't confess. He didn't beg for mercy. He simply said over and over again, "I didn't do it." And then, in 2010, something incredible happened. Palumbo, the man who had blamed him, confessed that he had lied. He admitted that Richard had nothing to do with the crime, that he had only said what he said to cut a deal, that he had sacrificed someone else's life to save his own. At first, the courts didn't believe him, but the Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan took the case. They investigated. They reopened the file. They interviewed witnesses. And finally, in 2018, 46 years after his arrest, Richard Phillips was exonerated and set free. When journalists asked him what he would do now, his answer surprised everyone. He said, "I'm going to paint." And that's what he did. During his time in prison, he had taught himself to draw and paint. Watercolors, mostly, and he continued after being released. Now, let me tell you something that speaks volumes about his character. Richard never received financial compensation from the state, not right away. While the legal process dragged on, he had no income and no house, no savings, nothing. So he started selling his paintings online, not for a lot, just enough to live. He didn't complain, he didn't lash out, he just moved forward. Eventually, in 2020, the state of Michigan awarded him $1.5 million for the wrongful conviction. But no money, no matter how much, could give him back the 46 years they stole. The family he lost, the opportunities he missed, the time that never returned. Richard Phillips could have come out bitter, but instead, he came out peaceful. He said that prison taught him patience, that solitude helped him understand himself, and that, while he doesn't forgive the system, he forgives the man who lied. Because hate, he says, is just another prison.